Today we begin a 7-week series, and these are the 7 I am statements that Jesus makes about himself. Now, I'm really convinced that if we all could know Jesus better, we would love him more. I think there's a lot of people that don't know if they like Jesus or not because they honestly have never gotten close enough to him to actually figure out whether or not they like him, that they believe in him, they could trust in him. You know, it's different to know about God, and then it's very different to know God. I mean, knowing God is way more than just information. It is an experience. It is a relationship. I'm going to say that again. Knowing God is more than information. It is an experience. It's a relationship. You know, when I was 6 years old, my family did something pretty radical. We left the United States and we moved to the Philippines. Now, both of my parents are only children, and we weren't very close to my mother's side of the family. We were more close to my father's parents, who lived in Bloomfield, Iowa. But when I was 6, my dad, because he felt like this is what God had called him to do, took their only 3 grandchildren all across the world. I mean, I look back now because, by the way, have you heard? I'm going to be a grandfather. Okay, so, yeah, I'm excited about that. I'm weirded out by everybody coming up to me and saying, "Hey, Grandpa." I'm like, really? I don't know. They say it's good. I'll trust that it will be. I feel like you're just calling me an old guy. I don't like that. Anyway, when I was 6 years old, we went to the Philippines, 21 days on a passenger liner from San Francisco to Manila. And back in those days, this was before satellite communications. This was before cable TV. I mean, this was before Facebook and the internet and Instagram. This was before digital cameras. Anybody here ever used like a film camera? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you do remember that day. I mean, it just took so long to get pictures, right? You had to take them, develop them, choose which one you like. Now, we've got that camera with us everywhere we go. So you know what? That separation for me as a child from my grandparents was a big one. I mean, it would take a month for my grandparents to write and mail a letter before it would get to us. And then the response would take a month to go back to them. My dad would sometimes read their letters at dinner and tell us about what was going on in the great metropolis of Bloomfield, Iowa. 3,000 people, 2 miles from one farm to the next to find another person where my grandparents lived. Okay, and my grandmother always started out with a weather report. We lived in Manila. It's always hot, humid, and chance of rain. I kept wondering, why is my grandmother so fixated on the weather? And then I moved to Missouri, and I get it. You gotta know. I remember when we went back to the States for the first time after not seeing them for 4 years. I mean, I went from 6 years old to 10 years old, which was a long time in child years, okay? We landed in Chicago, and we were going to meet my grandparents, and I was 10, my brother was 8, my sister was 7, and the plan was we were going to get in the car with my grandparents and drive 5 hours from Chicago back to Bloomfield, Iowa, and my parents got in another car, and then we're going to go to a preacher's meeting. And so we were pretty excited about being able to go to the farm. And I remember walking down the concourse, and as we walked down the concourse, every time I saw a grandfatherly-looking couple, I didn't say elderly-looking couple, because I'm changing my verbiage, because I am a grandfather, okay. I said to my dad, "Hey, Dad, are those my grandparents?" "No, Eddie, that's not your grandparents." We walked a little bit more. I saw another couple. "Are those my grandparents?" "Nope, those are not your grandparents." Finally, we saw another couple, and they started walking toward us, and my dad said, "Those are your grandparents." And so they came up, and we exchanged kind of an awkward hug because these are my grandparents, but like I don't really know them. And then my dad took us outside and put us in their car, our luggage in their car, and we were going to travel 5 hours with them without my parents. And just before the door shut, I remember leaning out and asking my dad one more time, "You're sure these are our grandparents, aren't you?" We got to their farm late that night, and my brother and I shared a bed in one of their bedrooms. And in the middle of the night, my brother wet the bed. I was wet because he wet the bed. I'm not bitter, but I remember. I'm like, "Greg, what are you thinking? This is gross. I am wet because you wet the bed, and the bed is wet. And now we can't even sleep in this bed because we're like sleeping in, you know." So we got out of the bed, cleaned up as best as we could, slept for the rest of the night on the floor, curling up under a rubberized little mat that was the rug in the room. It was miserable because my brother wet the bed. And we had no idea what's going to happen when we tell my grandmother that, like, he wet the bed. Is she going to go ballistic? Is she going to be angry? Is she going to scold us? Is she going to punish us? Are we going to survive this moment? Like, I had no idea. Well, we got up early that morning because we couldn't sleep anymore on the floor, and we went down to the barn, and, the farm was such a great place to explore, and so we began to explore, and it was early, and, in the Philippines, church started at 8:30 in the morning, and so, I looked around, and it got to be like 8 o'clock. Nobody was stirring. I turned to my brother, and I says, "You know what? I kind of wonder, do our grandparents even go to church anywhere? I mean, are they even Christians?" Finally, about 9 o'clock, my grandmother came out and called us to come eat. And she said, "We're going to have to get ready and go to church because church starts at 10 o'clock. I never heard such a thing, that church could start at 10 o'clock. When you were a kid, the way you do it in your home of origin is the way everybody does it in the world, you think. Well, at breakfast, I had to tell my grandmother, "Grandma, Greg wet the bed." And then my grandmother said, "Oh, that's all right, boys. I'll take care of that. Here, have breakfast." You know what? For the first time, I thought, she's like a really kind and gracious woman. I kind of like my grandmother. Over the years, I got to know her better. Anytime I came home from college, because I lived with them during the breaks, she would always have supper ready for me and always prepared my favorite dessert. I never told her it was my favorite. She just figured it out on her own. And without announcement or fanfare, because that wasn't my grandmother, she just always had my favorite dessert. I discovered that my grandmother did go to church, and that my grandmother had a relationship with God that she didn't talk very much about. But I noticed it was really real to her, because I would, on a regular basis, catch her in her chair in the living room by the window next to the table where her Bible stayed all the time. And she would be reading the Bible, and she would be praying. My grandmother was a horse whisperer. My grandfather raised ponies. He had about 20-something ponies. And we got to ride them, and that was so much fun. But sometimes we'd go out looking for them in the pasture, and we'd chase those ponies around forever. Finally, we'd just go in and say, "Grandma, can you help us?" She'd walk out into the pasture. I don't know what she said. She had this thing that she I forgot what the word she used. But as soon as she called the horses, they came right up to her hand. She grabbed them by the neck. She said, "Here you go, boys. Let's put the halter on them." When I was in college, my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. And one Christmas break, I went home, and as I walked in the front door, my grandfather was right there to meet me, and he said, Eddie, he says, your grandmother is worse. We're going to have to take her back to the hospital. And the sadness all over him was so strong. After saying that, he left and went to the barn or the garage or somewhere. I saw my grandmother laying on the couch in the living room. And at this point, I loved her so much. But you know, I'm a college man. So I walked in, trying to be strong. I knelt down beside her, and she reached her hand out to me, and I held it. And I couldn't be strong anymore. And I began to just cry. And my grandmother said, Eddie, it's going to be okay. I know where I'm going, but I worry about your granddad. And then that year she died. And when she died, I was grief-stricken because I had gotten to know her, and I adored her. She was a great woman, a quiet, strong, resourceful, loving grandmother. And I watched her die with grace and strength and peace. You know, I think a lot of why people don't know how to love God because they never have really gotten to know him. And Jesus makes several statements about who he is. They're called the I am statements, and we're going to be looking at these from now until Easter, which is 7 weeks away, by the way. And today we're going to begin with the I am statement that goes like this: I am the bread of life. John chapter 6, verses 35 to 40, and Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I say to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that all he has given me I should lose nothing, but raise it up in the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. You know, in this passage, Jesus kind of like peels back for us a complicated and mysterious work of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, though he's not mentioned in this passage. And really what he's saying here is that I have come to do the will of my Father. This is a plan that we have known from before creation began. It's in theological terms, it's called the plan of the ages. You see, because God, who knows all things, has to know all things before they happen. And so before God even created Adam and Eve, before the fall and the rebellion of human beings against the God who created them, God already knew they were going to do that. But he wasn't caught off guard. He had already laid careful plans to rescue, redeem, and to buy back human beings. And Jesus is referring to that right here. And you know what Jesus, when he says, and I'm here not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. Do you know what that will was? The will of God was that Jesus would come and live a life, a perfect life, and then Jesus would lay down his life on a cross and pay for the sin and the rebellion of all human beings. Jesus says, I'm committed to doing this. I will fulfill the plan. I will rescue all who come to me. And I will raise them up in the last day, and I will give them everlasting life. I am the bread of life. You know, if you fast forward into the Gospels, Jesus takes the Passover supper and he uses the elements of bread and then the cup to describe what the redemption was going to look like. You know, when the bread is broken, it symbolizes what Jesus agreed to do. His body would be broken for us. And in the Gospels, we read how he is taken and beaten and scourged. And they put a crown of thorns on his head and they nailed him to a cross. And his body was destroyed. And the cup, this is his blood. The blood of the new covenant, a promise from God Almighty, God eternal, that says, if you will come to me, I will forgive you and rescue you, and I will welcome you into everlasting life with your sins forgiven. Every day, every Sunday, James, my son, always asks me, Dad, topic. So I have to think of how to summarize the topic. There are some Sundays I tell him he doesn't like that topic. Today I told him this is about bread. Oh, I like that. That's a good one. Because we all like our bread, right? Yeah, we do. I mean, isn't one of the best things God ever did was to give us something to eat? I mean, you know what? When we eat, it's a party. It's a festival. I mean, I'm trying to be on a low-carb diet, and I'm preaching on the bread of life, and I couldn't stand it anymore. And I went and made myself a piece of toast, and it was good. This teaching of Jesus comes in John chapter 6, which is very typical of the way John is written, that Jesus does a sign, a miracle, and then he takes that miracle and jumps into a deep teaching of truths from God. Now, in John chapter 6, Jesus is teaching people. They come out to him on the around the Sea of Galilee, and as Jesus finishes teaching one day, he looks at all of these people. There were 5,000 men plus women and children, so you can calculate however you want. I'm going to go with at least, one woman per man, or, 5 plus 5 is 10,000. That's a big crowd. And Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, man, these people have been here a long time. We're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. They must be hungry by now. And Jesus asks Philip, what are we going to feed these people? And Philip, he's a practical guy. He says, you know what? If we had this much money, that wouldn't even be enough to feed 10,000 people. Let me ask you, what would it cost to feed 10,000 people? It'd cost a lot more money than probably you have in your pocket. And Jesus is having this conversation, and Andrew comes up and he says, well, there's this little guy, and he's willing to give his lunch to you, Jesus. He's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. But what is that among so many? Seriously, can one little boy's lunch feed 10,000 people? Well, I don't think so. And Jesus surprises them when he says, that'll do just fine. Have everybody sit down in groups. Jesus takes the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fishes, he prays over them and gives thanks, and then he begins to break up the bread and the fish, giving it to the disciples, and he says, now go out there and feed them. Now, you might have thought that everybody would get like a little appetizer or a little snack, but the text clearly says that they fed everybody until they were all full. This was like an all-you-could-eat, apparently, buffet. You know what I'm saying? And then Jesus says, now go collect the fragments. And when they did, they brought back 12 baskets full of bread fragments. That is incredible. That was an amazing miracle. And the people that saw it thought so too. Because in John 6, 14 to 16, this is what they said. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, He departed again to the mountain by himself alone. You know what? They said, man, let's make this man king. Lunch every day on him. This is great. We all want politicians who will give us everything we want, don't we? We're going to exit that topic right now. You know, you and I think, well, if we could have a viral sort of Instagram post or video and the world hears about it, man, that's the time to take that and go as far as you can go. You would have thought that Jesus would have celebrated, let's make Jesus king. He doesn't. Because Jesus says, I am not here to be your food king. I've got a much bigger plan than just feeding you. Now, we love our food. In America this year, we're going to spend something like $1.7 trillion on food. That's a lot of money. Just a little trivia. What condiment do you think is the most popular condiment in America, especially if you calculate how much we spend on that particular condiment? Do you think it's ketchup? How many of you think it's ketchup? Raise your hand. Okay. How about mayonnaise? Any mayonnaise voters here? Okay. How about barbecue sauce? How about some salsa? Mustard. I'm agreeing with you. It's mayonnaise. $2 billion is spent every year on mayonnaise. And some of you are mad, but that's the facts. Every year we spend $38 billion on pizza. Anybody spent some money on pizza this year so far? Man, it's good stuff, isn't it? We will eat 8 billion chickens in America this year. And we will consume 50 billion burgers. Because we like us some food in America. It is God's gift. And these people were impressed because Jesus had fed them. Jesus went up to the mountain and left them. The disciples got in the one ship that was there and went to the other side of Galilee. And the people chased them down. In John 6:25. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? You know what? People have always wanted to try to have this great understanding of who God is. The first question, and you should take this question for yourself. How did you get here, Jesus? How did you get across the water? And you know why they were asking that? Because they knew that the disciples had gotten into the boat, but Jesus was in the mountain and there was no boat left. And so how in the world did the disciples get all the way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee? And then Jesus was with them. Turns out, how did you get here? Now, there is a story about how he got there. I don't have time to talk to you about that. You read the whole chapter on your own. But you know what? There is this propensity in us to be distracted by what we think about God and wanting to know more details about who he is and what he is like. And we kind of have this idea that, you know what? I will decide whether or not I believe that God is really God or not. Do you know why? Our fundamental sin of all time is this. The first sin was offered this way. Eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and you will be like God. You will be your own God. You will be able to decide with the authority of God in your life what you believe, what you don't believe, what you will accept, what you will not accept, what is right and what is wrong. And oftentimes we begin with the topic of God. So I hear a lot of people, I have friends who say, you know, I just don't like the way God is. So I don't know if I'm going to believe in God. The truth is, you have the freedom to decide that. The sad reality of this particular occasion was that Jesus demonstrated the power of God. Nobody can just create that much food out of 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So Jesus, just how in the world did you get here? You know what Jesus does? He ignores their question. Second thing that they ask, what do we have to do? I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. What do we have to do? Second thing that we're prone to do, and that is, I want to be saved, and I want to get the credit for my own salvation. Because if I'm my own God, I should know how. We even use God and Jesus and decide if we will do the right thing, we will be saved. Not because it's a gift, but because we did the right thing. I'd like to have credit for my own salvation. Is that what you're like? Do you ever feel that way? I mean, I always wanted credit for when I was a good boy. Jesus says, actually, you can't do anything. What do you have to do? You just need to believe in me. Believe in this incredible plan where the Father sent his Son to pay the price of your rescue. Some people say, well, I'm just not good enough to be saved. Yeah, you're right, you're not. You never will be. You know what Jesus says? I'm good enough. I paid. What do you have to do? Just believe in me. Just accept me. Ephesians 2:8-9 is one of my favorite passages because it brings such clarity to this whole idea of salvation. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. You can't be your own God and save yourself. Not possible. You just need to believe in Jesus. Then they come to Jesus with this third question. Well, show us a sign. How impertinent of this crowd. He had just fed 10,000 people in front of them. I mean, they were so impressed by this sign. But Jesus says, the problem is you saw the bread and appreciated the free lunch, but you did not see the sign and understand the power behind what happened. That was not about a free lunch. That was about the power of God flowing in the person of Jesus Christ. In this conversation, you can read it for yourself. They went on to say, show us a sign. Actually, you know what? Moses gave the people bread daily for 40 years. I mean, we're glad for one meal, but we want this bread every day. Moses gave them bread every day. Jesus says, yes. And everyone who ate that manna died. I am the bread of life. And if you believe in me, you will never really die. Because I will raise you up. And I will bring you into everlasting life. Sometimes when we're asking God to show us a sign, we very subtly are acting like the God of our own life. Now, God of heaven, you need to serve me and do what I think you need to do so I can be happy with you. If you ever disappoint me, God, you make me angry and I can walk away at any time. Here's a clue. If you're angry at God because someone in your life died, a tragedy has happened in your life, you've lost a job, had a financial setback. If you are angry at God because something negative or bad happened, then can I tell you something? You know what your problem is? You're trying to be God when you're not God. And this God who is this incredibly good God who has has good intentions for you, you got to stop being mad. Be sad, be disappointed, be confused, but submit to his authority and let God be God. And in that moment of surrender, you will receive satisfaction and rescue. He will help you. You know, my dad just recently went back to the Philippines. He's 84 years old. Glad he made it. A little bit nervous about him traveling. He did travel with my brother, which made me feel better. But you know, this Sunday he preached, and I listened to part of his message thanks to live stream, Facebook, you know what I'm saying? And you know what my dad said? He said, you know, I have decided that in my life, I'm going to trust God even when bad things happen. Like 2 years ago when my wife died, I was so sad. But you know what? The Bible says you should give thanks in everything because this is God's will concerning you. So it hurt and it was hard, but it was God's will, and I will accept God's will. You know what? It was hard, he said, to have open heart surgery and to recover. It was a very difficult time in my life. And you know what? But I decided that I'm going to just trust God and let him be God and ask for his help when I need it, because that is the only way to live. And I'm thinking, wow, there you go. Some of you are angry at God today because he hasn't done what you want him to do. That should be a red flag that you're trying to be God. You need to just surrender and let him be God and ask for help to get through. That's really the only way. Because here's the truth. You make a pretty lousy God. You don't know stuff. You're not powerful enough. You can't overcome sickness and death. You can't. You need a God on your side, bigger and wiser, more infinite and self-sustaining than you are. Those who have come to Jesus and received him as the bread of life against all circumstances have been satisfied. On February 21, 2020, a man on death row by the name of Nick Sutton was executed for a murder he had committed in 1985. He was in prison for murdering his grandmother and 2 other men. And in 1985, while in prison, he murdered a fellow prisoner when he was 28 years old. Nick grew up in a very difficult environment marked by abuse, neglect, substance abuse, and mental illness. And he, at a very early age, ended up in jail. And then, 35 years after the final murder, he was convicted. He was sent to the electric chair, and he died. His final words were these: I'm just grateful to be a servant of God. And I'm looking forward to being in his presence. And I thank you. You know, 3 correction officers testified on his behalf at the appeal for his execution. And they said this: a group of 5 inmates armed with knives and other weapons surrounded me and attempted to take me hostage. Nick and another inmate confronted them, physically removed them from the situation, removed me from the situation, and escorted me to the safety of the trap gate in another building. Another one said, I owe my life to Nick Sutton. Nick Sutton died. And in his final statement, this is what he said. I hope I do a much better job in the next life than I did in this one. If I could leave one thing with you, it is don't ever give up on the ability of Jesus Christ to fix someone or a problem. He can fix anything. Don't ever underestimate his ability. He has made my life meaningful and fruitful through my relationships with family and friends. So even in my death, I am coming out a winner. You know what that is? That's a man who tasted and confirms Jesus is the bread of life. And if you receive him, you will be satisfied. And nothing can defeat you.